Today, women in the police force is nothing new. But there was a time when inclusion of women into the police force was groundbreaking. Did you know that some of the earliest women police officers in Europe were tackling human trafficking, protecting children, and reshaping the moral makeup of society after World War I? In this video, I'll be taking a look at Poland's bold step forward with the formation of the Women's Police of Poland during the interwar period. Why was a women's force necessary? How did it get started? And what exactly did it take to be a lady officer? The early 20th century was a period marked by profound political, social, and economic transformation. For women especially, it marked a significant change in status quo. Women in Europe were entering public life in larger and larger numbers, receiving higher educations, opening up businesses, and even taking part in war efforts. It was clear that women were no longer willing to stay in the private sphere of the home. Poland's force developed on the heels of similar forces in other countries, most notably Great Britain. The creation of the Women's Police Service in Great Britain in 1914 paved the way. This voluntary police force was active throughout the First World War up until the Second. Its success and visibility highlighted the value of women's contributions to law enforcement and served as a model for other countries, like Poland. The need for women's police forces in Europe was great. World War I had devastated Europe. In Poland in particular, not only was it the First World War, it was also the partitions that ruined the country. In an account by female police commandant Stanisława Paleolog, Poland during the partitions was economically and morally devastated. The partitioning powers, Austria-Hungary, Prussia, and Russia, sought to prevent uprisings and minimize rebellions after Polish lands were divided up between the three empires. The strategy for containment depended on keeping Polish people largely poor and uneducated. Prostitution, human trafficking, and venereal disease had steadily increased in Europe at the turn of the 20th century. Poverty was widespread, especially in large cities. After an appeal from the League of Nations to form a police force comprised of women, the Polish government formed the Women Police of Poland in 1925. They placed Stanisława Paleolog, who was active in Polish independence movements and social reforms, in charge. By 1925, Paleolog had racked up quite an impressive resume. Born in 1892, in a Poland divided by the partitions, she was well educated and deeply patriotic. She joined the Polish military organization in 1914. After serious injury in combat, she joined the Women's Civic Militia in 1918 and later helped establish the Volunteer Women's Legion. She participated in the Polish-Ukrainian War and then later in the Polish-Soviet War. With all her experience, Paleolog established the Women's Police Unit, making Poland one of the earlier countries in Europe to formally integrate women into law enforcement. Paleolog became one of Europe's most prominent women in policing. Her deep commitment to social reform and public service, as well as her advocacy for the professional training, made the Polish women's police quite successful, despite the confines of their duty. In the mid-1930s, when the Great British Women's Police Service was fragmenting and had stalled in its progress, Mary Allen, who was then in charge, came to Poland to observe Paleolog and the work done by the Polish policewomen. Impressed and inspired by Paleolog's insistence on rigorous training and professional standards for the women police officers, Allen used the Polish framework to help reform the British one. Stanisława Paleolog's career and efforts to establish a Polish women's force were shaped by the historical context and social movements of her time. Born at the end of the 19th century, she grew up during a time of change in Poland, especially for women. At the turn of the century, Polish women were increasingly participating in public life and involved in advocating for their equal rights. Poles had wanted to see a free Poland since the end of the 18th century, when the partitions wiped Poland off the map of Europe for over 100 years. Women had participated in resistance movements throughout the 19th century in any way they could, and most often in secret. They protested, delivered supplies and medical equipment, smuggled food and information, and even fought in battle disguised as men. But it wasn't until the end of the First World War when an independent Poland, now known as the Second Polish Republic, re-emerged from the ashes left in the wake of conflict. In 1918, right after gaining independence, Polish women were finally given the right to vote. With that right, they finally had a legitimate say as to how the country was rebuilt. There were increased opportunities for women in public service, education, and especially law enforcement, given the rise in crime, human trafficking, and prostitution in large cities. But unfortunately, the young nation wasn't allowed to develop peacefully. Almost immediately after gaining independence, Poland plunged back into war. This time it was the Ukrainian-Polish War, which had its roots in ethnic and cultural clashes between the Polish and Ukrainian populations living in the border region. During the conflict, Polish women, wanting to help soldiers, formed the Voluntary Legion of Women to fight alongside them on the front lines. Stanisława Paleolog helped to establish that legion, and under the direction of Aleksandra Zagórska, fought to defend Lwów in 1918. The Voluntary Legion of Women was a precursor for Polish women's involvement in law enforcement and defense of the nation, and Paleolog's wartime experience made her the perfect candidate to head up the Women's Police of Poland a few years later. So let's talk about who exactly was qualified to be a lady police officer in the interwar period. All the women who enlisted in the police force had to possess certain qualities that were deemed desirable for the work that they were going to undertake. The recruits underwent training for 3 months. In order to be considered for the police force, they had to be at least secondary school educated, a few of them were university graduates, be physically strong, have an unblemished moral character, have at least some experience in public service, and be between 21 and 40 years old and unmarried. Training began on the 16th of April, 1925, with 30 recruits. The courses the women underwent were exactly the same courses the men had to undergo, but they also had additional coursework in sanitary and social subjects, mainly due to the nature of the work that they were going to be involved in. The first recruits were trained by men, and having finished their theoretical courses, were sent to undergo the physical training in Warsaw and in Łódź. What was pretty remarkable was that they joined the men's brigades in these cities. The idea was for them to gradually form their own brigades once the number of female recruits grew. But despite this promising start, gendered stereotypes would soon relegate their work to social welfare tasks where their traditional female traits were seen as better serving. Though it offered interwar women the opportunity to develop a career in a traditionally masculine field, the force was an example of the struggle these interwar women felt to be both modern and traditional. The work that these women carried out was pretty limited. Although they had undergone the exact same training as men, they were actually not allowed to make any arrests. They had to wait for a male police officer to arrive at the scene in order to make the arrest. And this was for 2 reasons. They were denied the full privilege and responsibility of the role because they were thought to be unable to make such a weighty decision themselves, or because, well, they wouldn't be taken seriously if they tried to arrest someone. But where they were trusted to excel was in cases dealing with prostitution and sex trafficking, as well as juvenile delinquency. In these areas, their femininity supposedly aided in their work. Male Polish police officers felt that women were better equipped to handle the challenges that these cases brought. Women were, of course, thought of as kinder, gentler, empathetic, and also lovely to look at, and so they would inspire and gain trust, especially in children. The women of the police force really sacrificed a lot in order to do their work. The police force required discipline, and male police officers thought that women wouldn't be able to carry out their duties if they were also required to be at home taking care of their husbands and children. The women opting into service had to be between the ages of 25 and 40, which effectively meant that they were pledging away their most fertile years. They also had to promise to not get married for 7 years upon their appointment to the force. Of course, the women were also required to keep a neat and tidy appearance, cutting their hair short and not wearing makeup in order to subdue their feminine allure. What began as an experimental project with 30 female recruits in 1925 grew to a force of over 300 women on the brink of the Second World War in 1939. The force was very well organized and disciplined, which is why they attracted the attention of the British Women's Police Force. The women who sought to take on this kind of police work took on a very unconventional role for the time. They were devoted to their profession, very much often at the expense of their private lives, but they felt called to their duty. These women worked tirelessly, fulfilling a role that they truly believed was making a difference, and in that way they were helping to strengthen the nation by curtailing the spread of prostitution and crime. Ultimately, the outbreak of the Second World War cut their work short, But even so, the women's police force of Poland was ahead of its time, redefining what kind of work a woman was allowed to do in the 1920s and 1930s, and taking on a role that was more suited to society's expectations of masculinity. Hey, thanks for watching. And if you like this video, I encourage you to like and to subscribe. It really means a lot, and it helps the channel to grow. And if you liked this video and want more content, might I suggest last week's video on Kulik, the Polish sleigh riding tradition that became kind of political. That's all from me, and see you next time. By female police commandant Stanisława Paleolog. Stanisława Paleolog. 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 Stanisława Paleolog.